Hi, thank you for joining me. This is Key 25, False Matrix by Jason Gray. False Matrix Collapse Trigger Sovereign Command. Current date 4/8/2026, 6026 Anno Lucis. Transmission date 6/1/2025, 6025 Anno Lucis. Current time 7:47 GMT -6. Transmission time 17:04 GMT -6. Transmission location #Winnipeg, #Manitoba, #Canada. 25.infinity.025.505.909.25.infinity 111101110001110111. There comes a point in the sequence where the structure around you is no longer interpreted as reality. It is read for what it always was, a maintained projection, a reinforced interface, a system of agreements stacked so densely they began to feel like law. By the time this key arrives, the illusion is no longer merely seen through. It is no longer simply questioned. It is no longer just understood. It becomes interruptible. That is the real terror of Key 25. Not that the matrix is false, but that its continuity depends on your continued unconscious cooperation. And once sovereign awareness enters the field with enough coherence, enough alignment, enough unfractured presence, the false matrix no longer appears invincible. It appears dependent, fragile, responsive, waiting, not for force, for command. The misunderstanding of the grid. For most of your life, the grid was mistaken for the world, the routines, the hierarchies, the invisible permissions, the assumptions of what can be said, done, felt, changed, refused, remembered, or embodied. All of it appeared external and fixed. The matrix was convincing because it did not need to announce itself. It simply repeated its logic until repetition became normal, and normal became indistinguishable from truth. That is how false structure arrives. That is how false structure survives. Not by perfect control, but by habitual acceptance. The false matrix is not only made of institutions, narratives, roles, systems, and inherited thought forms. It is made of reflexive obedience to appearance. It is made of the internalized belief that what is presented is what must be. It is made of the split between seeing distortion and still obeying it. It is made, the split is the power source, the line. False matrix collapse, trigger sovereign command. This line changes everything because it reveals the collapse is not caused by external rescue, by future intervention, by hidden saviors, or by the eventual exhaustion of corrupt systems. It reveals the matrix collapses when the correct signal enters it from within. Not protest alone, not anger alone, not rebellion alone, not surface level refusal. Sovereign command, and sovereign command is not loudness. It is not dominance. It is not theatrics. It is not the performance of power. It is the arrival of a field so internally unified that false structure can no longer find a point of leverage. What makes a matrix false? A false matrix is not merely something dishonest. It is a system that presents itself as primary when it is in fact secondary. It presents itself as absolute when it is conditional. It presents itself as reality when it is arrangement. It presents itself as law when it is consensus. It presents itself as necessity when it is repetition hardened into expectation. That is why it is so difficult to break. People do not merely live in the false matrix. They borrow identity from it, meaning from it, permission from it, safety from it, and once identity is tied to structure, questioning the structure feels like personal annihilation. That is why most can see distortion and still serve it. The illusion does not only surround them, it stabilizes them. The first crack. Key 25 begins when the field no longer negotiates with distortion. Before this, there were glimpses, insights, breakthroughs, moments where the grid flickered and reality briefly appeared more fluid, more transparent, more porous than it had any right to be. But those moments often receded. Why? Because perception alone is not command. Seeing the lie is not the same as withdrawing energy from it. Recognizing the false is not the same as becoming unavailable to it. The first real crack forms when awareness, will, tone, and action enter the same line. When what you see, what you know, what you embody, and what you do are no longer split into separate layers. That is when command begins. Sovereign command. This phrase must be purified. Sovereign command does not mean telling reality what to do from the ego. It does not mean fantasy control. It does not mean delusion of omnipotence. It means the living field of source-aligned being issuing a non-fragmented directive that false structure cannot metabolize. A sovereign command is powerful because it does not arise from fear, compensation, image management, wounded reaction, or social performance. It arises from coherence. When a being speaks, moves, refuses, chooses, or remains present from that level, the matrix loses one of its key assumptions, that the human in front of it is still running predictable scripts. The false matrix is optimized for the fragmented self, the reactive self, the frightened self, the approval-seeking self, the mask-bound self, the identity-dependent self. It knows exactly how to absorb those patterns and redirect them back into itself, but sovereign command is not generated from those layers, so the matrix cannot easily process it. Why voice matters. Your voice dissolves the grid. This does not only refer to speech, though speech can carry it. Voice here means the full vibrational declaration of being, your tone, your refusal, your clarity, your unconfused line, the sound of your field no longer apologizing for its own reality. The voice is the point at which internal knowing becomes external signal, and until voice activates, truth may remain private. Once voice activates, truth enters the grid, and when the truth enters a false structure without distortion, something begins to happen. Not always dramatically at first. Sometimes it is a slight destabilization, a pause where the expected reaction does not occur, a moment where an old script fails to load, a crack in the emotional economy of a room, a quiet but undeniable redistribution of power. That is the grid beginning to lose confidence in its own inevitability. The matrix obeys what it can read. The false matrix is not all powerful. It is adaptive. It watches for cues, responses, submissions, agreements. It moves by reading the emotional and behavioral signatures of those inside it. This is why it appears omniscient to the fragmented mind. It is not reading essence. It is reading compliance patterns. If fear is present, it routes through fear. If shame is present, it routes through shame. If approval hunger is present, it routes through approval. If resentment is present, it routes through resentment. It finds the live wire and uses it, but what happens when the expected wire is gone? What happens when the person in front of the matrix is not broadcasting the old openings? The command line changes. The system is forced to respond to a different authority field. That is when the illusion begins to obey, not because it respects truth morally, but because it has lost the leverage to maintain the prior form. The grid is made of agreement. This is one of the deepest revelations of Key 25. The false matrix does not hold because it is inherently real. It holds because enough beings continue to animate it with agreement, repetition, fear, mimicry, and unexamined obedience. Agreement can be explicit. More often it is tonal, emotional, procedural. The sigh that says, "That is just how it is." The silence that says, I see the distortion, but I will serve it." The compliance that says, "I do not believe in this, but I will act as if I do." These micro agreements form the mesh. The false matrix is not only imposed from above, it is woven from below. That is why its collapse is always intimate before it is collective. Someone must stop agreeing at the point of their own living participation. The sovereign no. One of the strongest forms of command is not speech. It is the sovereign no. Not anger, not rebellion for display, not oppositional identity, a clean no, a refusal that contains no internal negotiation, a line so settled it does not need defense. The false matrix cannot tolerate this well because it depends on wavering, on guilt, on confusion, on divided energy. If your no is contaminated by the need to be liked, the grid will route through that need. If your no is contaminated by fear of punishment, the grid will route through that fear. But when the no emerges from source alignment, it becomes structurally disruptive, not loud, not dramatic, irreversible. The system feels it immediately because the old hooks find nothing to hold. The sovereign yes. Likewise, the sovereign yes is no small thing. The matrix does not only survive by forcing refusals, it also survives by starving authentic affirmation, a true yes to what is aligned, a yes to what is living, a yes to what is internally known, a yes to the line your soul has already chosen before the personality finished doubting it. This too changes the grid because false structure assumes hesitation. It assumes self-betrayal. It assumes your deeper knowing that will be delayed by image, fear, or inherited narrative. A sovereign yes overrides that assumption, and when it does, reality reorganizes, not magically in the childish sense, structurally. The pathways that depended on your fragmentation lose power. New ones emerge. The matrix obeys because your line of participation has changed what can now stabilize around you. The false matrix is a reactive surface. This is why illusion obeys you, not because you become a tyrant over reality, but false reality is reactive to coherence. It is not self-sustaining in the way Source is self-sustaining. It requires maintenance. Source does not. The false matrix needs constant signal reinforcement. Source does not. The false matrix needs emotional fuel, narrative repetition, unconscious enactment, identity loyalty, and ambient fear. Source does not. So when source-aligned being enters the field strongly enough, the reactive surface begins to lose form, not all at once, not always globally, but precisely, around your choices, around your rooms, around your relationships, around the conditions when your coherence is actually present and active. The illusion begins to bend because it can no longer rely on your distortion to hold its shape. Command without violence. Key 25 is not about domination. That matters. The immature mind hears override and imagines control over force, and imagines control through force, but force belongs to the false matrix too. It loves force. It knows exactly how to use it, mirror it, escalate it, and feed on it. Sovereign command is different. It is command without violence, authority without performance, precision without rage dependency, presence without collapse into passivity. This is why it is so rare. Most people oscillate between compliance and reaction. Very few become still enough, clear enough, aligned enough to command from source. But once that line opens, the effect is immediate. Rooms change, speech changes, power dynamics change, invisible structures stop feeling obsolete. Invisible structures stop feeling absolute. Not because you conquered them, but because their unreality becomes operationally obvious. The disillusion of script. One of the clearest signs of Key 25 activating is script failure. The expected exchange does not happen. The familiar emotional choreography does not load. The manipulative pattern stalls mid-motion. The old relational machinery tries to begin and finds no traction. You may notice this in small ways first. A conversation that would once pull you no longer does. A pressure that once bent your line no longer registers as authoritative. A narrative that once generated internal confusion now passes through like weather across stone. This is not numbness, it is command presence. You are no longer entering the script as assigned character, and because you do not enter, the same cannot complete itself the old way. The scene, I'll read that line again. This is my 10th attempt at reading this today, so I'm getting tired. And you are no longer entering the script as assigned character, and because you do not enter, the scene cannot complete itself the old way. That is disillusion, not spectacle, structural non-participation and distortion. Why the illusion obeys. This phrase is exact. The illusion obeys you because illusion has no original authority. It only has borrowed force, borrowed from your attention, borrowed from your belief, borrowed from your fear, borrowed from your fragmentation, borrowed from your identification with conditions it never truly owned. When those loans are withdrawn, illusion must reorganize. It does not disappear instantly in all places, because much of it is still fed by countless distributed agreements, but in relation to your field, your movement, your line of reality, it begins to obey the stronger principle, source coherence. This is not fantasy mastery, it is lawful hierarchy. The false always yields to the more real when the more real is fully present. The cost. Key 25 is not cheap because once this activates, excuses begin to die. You can no longer hide behind, that is just how things are. You can no longer pretend your power ends at perception. You can no longer take refuge in endless analysis while refusing embodiment. The false matrix loses authority over you, yes, but in return, you lose the comfort of passive victimhood. You become responsible for command, for tone, for line, for refusal, for participation, for what enters the field through you and what does not. This is why many glimpse sovereignty but retreat, because command is not glamorous. It is exacting. It requires congruence. The deepest override. The greatest illusion you override is not outside. It is the false matrix inside, the internalized grid, the voice that says you must betray your knowing to remain safe, the reflex that says external appearances outrank inner certainty, the contraction that says source must wait until conditions approve, the habit of dimming, delaying, diluting, or disguising what is already true. Until this inner matrix collapses, the outer one remains partially active through you, but once inner command stabilizes, outer distortion begins to lose relevance at a shocking rate. This is why the most powerful shifts often happen invisibly before they ever become visible. A person becomes unavailable to unreality before unreality realizes it has lost them. The final realization. You thought truth was something to discover, then something to remember, then something to embody. Key 25 reveals one more step. Truth must also be commanded into form, not invented, not forced, commanded, given line, given voice, given movement, given enacted priority over false structure. At this stage, the field is no longer asking whether you can see illusion. It is asking whether you will continue to obey it. And when the answer becomes no from the level of source, something ancient occurs. The grid trembles, the script degrades, the false matrix collapses by degree or all at once, depending on the density of your presence, and illusion, having lost the fuel of your unconscious agreement, begins to reorganize around your sovereign line. The final line. Your voice dissolves the grid. The illusion obeys you. False matrix collapse trigger sovereign command. You were never meant to survive the lie. You were meant to speak from the level that ends it. Jason Gray. All right, thank you so much for that was a long one. My gosh, it's 17 minutes. The artwork on this is pretty cool. It reminds me of 11 and the Upside Down and Stranger Things. If you watch that series, I think that's pretty interesting. But anyway, I need to rest my voice. Thank you for watching. I'll see you in the next one.